morning my husband told me I was forgettable. I was standing at the kitchen counter making his coffee. Not my coffee. His. I'd been doing it for 4 years. 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, heated to exactly 140 degrees because he said anything hotter burned his tongue. I knew that. I knew the precise temperature that wouldn't burn my husband's tongue. And somehow I'd never stopped to ask myself when I'd started organizing my mornings around that kind of information. He came in from the living room still buttoning his shirt, phone in one hand, and said it so casually I almost missed it. My friends think you're not really ambitious enough for someone like me. I put down the mug. Someone like you, I repeated. You know what I mean. He didn't look up from his phone. Zach was saying the other night, and look, I'm not saying I agree, but he said he always pictured me with someone more driven, more successful, someone who had things going on. I stood there for a moment. The coffee was still steaming. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something, and the sound felt very far away. And what did you say? I asked. When Zach said that, he finally looked at me. I said you were great, obviously. A pause, but it got me thinking. I nodded slowly. Okay. That was all I said. Okay. That was all I said. Okay. He kissed me on the cheek, took the coffee, and left for work. I heard his car back out of the driveway. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, not moving, just listening to the silence he left behind. Then I picked up my phone and called my business partner. He finally said it out loud, I told her. She was quiet for a second. Then, what do you want to do? I looked around the kitchen, the mug he'd left on the wrong side of the counter, the cabinet he'd never once cleaned behind, the life I quietly built around someone who apparently needed his friends to remind him I existed. I want to finish the Hargrove deal, I said, and then I'll figure it out. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. My name is Sloan. I'm 31 years old, and for the past 4 years I've been married to a man named Brett. Brett Calloway, financial analyst, weekend golfer, person who has genuinely strong opinions about which sports bar has the best nachos. He is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He's charming, he's good-looking in a way that photographs well, and in the early years he made me feel like the most interesting person in any room. The problem is that I was actually the most interesting person in most rooms. I just never told him that. When Brett and I met, I was 26 and had just co-founded a boutique public relations and crisis management consultancy with my college roommate, Lee. We were operating out of a 2-bedroom apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, running on coffee and nerve and a client list that had exactly 4 names on it. I didn't talk about work much on our early dates, partly because I was exhausted, partly because I'd learned that men like Brett, confident, established, accustomed to being the most professionally impressive person at the table, sometimes got uncomfortable when you pulled back the curtain too early. So I kept it quiet. Just for a while, I told myself, and then a while turned into a year. And then we got engaged, and then somewhere between the wedding and the 2nd anniversary, keeping my professional life separate from our personal life became less of a strategy and more of a habit I'd forgotten how to break. Brett thought I did some kind of marketing consulting. He wasn't wrong exactly, he just didn't know the scale. By the time he stood in our kitchen and told me his friends thought I lacked ambition, Lee and I had grown our firm. Calloway and Park, though I used my maiden name professionally, to 14 full-time employees. We had offices in Charlotte and Atlanta. We had represented 3 Fortune 500 companies through major public crises. We had just finalized the paperwork on a strategic acquisition deal that valued our firm at just over $8 million. $8 million. And my husband thought I spent my days writing Instagram captions. I should explain why I let it go so long. It wasn't about hiding success from him. It was never that simple. In the beginning, I didn't have success to hide, just ambition, and a lot of uncertainty, and a particular exhaustion that comes from building something from scratch, while also trying to be a good partner to someone who needed a certain amount of emotional maintenance. Brett's confidence, I came to understand, was architectural. It needed load-bearing walls. He needed to be the one who knew things, who explained things, who came home with the news about a big client or a hard-won negotiation. I didn't consciously decide to give him that space. It just happened, the way a lot of things happen in long relationships, gradually and then completely. By the time I understood what I'd done, we'd built a life around it. His name was the one on our mortgage application, because his income was the one we'd disclosed. I kept my business accounts entirely separate, reinvested most of what I made, and quietly covered the gaps. The vacation he couldn't quite afford, the car payment he was embarrassed about, the month when his bonus didn't come through and suddenly the numbers didn't work. He knew I helped sometimes. He didn't ask how much. He never asked. That, I think, was the thing I kept coming back to in the months after the kitchen conversation. Not that he'd underestimated me. People underestimate women every day. I'd learned to use it as fuel. It was that he'd never been curious. Not once in 4 years had he sat down and asked me, with genuine interest, what my work actually involved. What I was building. What I was proud of. He talked about his work constantly. I knew the names of every colleague he'd ever mentioned, every deal, every frustrating client. I could have passed a quiz on Brett's professional life. He could not have told you the name of my business partner. The Hargrove deal closed on a Thursday in late October. It had taken 8 months of negotiation. Hargrove Media Group was acquiring us, not absorbing us, acquiring us, which meant Lee and I retained creative control and equity participation, and the deal included performance bonuses that could take our personal payouts significantly higher over the next 3 years. Our attorney, a formidable woman named Constance who I'd worked with for 2 years, called me from the parking garage of her office building the moment the wire transfer confirmed. "Congratulations," she said. "You just sold a piece of something extraordinary." I sat in my car for about 15 minutes after that call. I didn't cry. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, thinking about the apartment Lee and I had worked from in the beginning. And the first client who'd actually paid us, and every 2 a.m. I'd stayed up with a crisis that wasn't mine but that I treated like it was. And I thought, I built this. I actually built this. Then I drove home and made dinner, and Brett told me about a frustrating meeting with his department head, and I listened and I said the right things, and I did not mention the wire transfer confirmation sitting in my email. I had a plan. I just needed a few more weeks. Brett's birthday is in November. He turned 34 that year, and his friends, Zach, Marcus, and a rotating cast of others from his college years, had been planning a dinner for weeks. They'd booked out the private dining room at a restaurant called Hearthstone, which was the kind of place with a seasonal menu and no prices on the menu they hand to guests. I had made the reservation. That detail matters. They thought Marcus had called in a favor because Marcus knew someone who knew the owner. What Marcus didn't know was that I had quietly contacted the restaurant's events coordinator 6 weeks earlier, explained that I was a long-standing client, and arranged the entire evening. The private room, the custom tasting menu, the wine pairings, the cake that Brett had mentioned once 2 years ago wanting to try from a specific bakery in Dilworth. I had also, in the weeks prior, made sure that certain information would become available at a certain time. The press release about the Hargrove acquisition had been drafted by our PR team. It named both founders. It was set to go live that night. I know how that sounds. I've had time to think about it, and I'll admit there's a version of this that isn't flattering to me. But here's what I want you to understand. I wasn't doing it to hurt him. I was doing it because I had spent 4 years being invisible inside my own marriage, and I needed him to see, not just hear me tell him, but actually see what had been there all along while he'd been deciding whether I was remarkable enough. The dinner was on a Saturday. Lee knew everything. Constance knew enough. My friend Addie, who had been listening to me process this marriage for 2 years over long walks and longer phone calls, drove up from Colombia that weekend just to be nearby. "You don't have to do this exactly this way," Addie said. The afternoon before, we were sitting on my porch with tea. "I know," I said. "You could just tell him privately and see what happens." "I've been telling him for 4 years," I said. "Not with words, with everything else." I looked at my hands. He never looked. She nodded slowly. She didn't argue with me again. The dinner started at 7. There were 8 of us total. Brett, Zach, Marcus, 2 other friends I'd known peripherally for years, their partners and me. The private room had warm lighting and a long table with candles, and for the first hour and a half it was genuinely a nice evening. People told stories about Brett from college. Someone brought up a trip they'd all taken to Asheville years ago. The wine was exceptional, and I sat at the end of the table and felt almost peaceful. Zach, to his credit, was charming that night. He's one of those men who's very good at performing warmth in groups. It was only if you'd heard what he'd said about you to your husband that you'd clock the difference. Around the second course, Marcus's girlfriend, she'd been with him about 8 months, sharp and funny, the kind of woman who notices things, leaned over to me and said quietly, "What do you do again? I feel like I should know this and I'm blanking." "I run a PR and crisis firm," I said. "We just closed an acquisition deal this week, actually." She raised her eyebrows. "That's a big week?" It really was. Brett was across the table, deep in a conversation about football with Zach. He hadn't heard. Not yet. The moment came around the time they brought out the main course. Zach had been talking about a colleague of his who'd recently been featured in the Charlotte Business Journal, some 30 under 30 list, and he was doing the thing he did. The faint condescension wrapped in admiration. The way people talk about success when they want credit for noticing it. He turned to Brett. "You know what I always say," Zach said. "It's important to have a partner who pushes you, who's operating on your level." He glanced at me when he said it. Just for a fraction of a second. But I saw it. Brett shifted slightly in his seat. I picked up my wine glass. I wasn't angry, which surprised me. I'd expected to feel angry. Instead, I felt very calm, the particular calm that comes when you've been waiting for something for a long time and it's finally arrived. "That's interesting, Zach," I said. "What does operating on someone's level mean to you exactly?" He smiled. "You know, professionally, ambition, drive." "Sure," I said. I set down my glass. "Brett, can I show you something?" Brett looked at me with an expression I can only describe as wary. We'd been married long enough for him to know that tone. I pulled out my phone. I'd had the email open for 2 hours. The press release, with the Hargrove logo at the top, and our firm name, and the acquisition figure, and both founders' names. I turned the screen toward him. He read it. I watched his eyes move across the words. "This went live tonight," I said, "at 7. The table had gone quiet. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't needed to. Brett looked up from the phone. "Sloan. The acquisition values the firm at $8 million, I said. "Lee and I built it from a 2-bedroom apartment in 2018. We currently have 14 employees. I paused. "I've been running it since before we got married." The silence was total. Zach put down his fork. Marcus's girlfriend across the table had stopped pretending to look at her plate. Brett was very still. He was doing the math. I could see it happening in real time. The years, the accounts, the vacations, the months when the money had been short and then, somehow, hadn't been. The car he drove that he'd assumed was a lucky deal. The apartment we'd lived in before the house that had been mine, on a lease in my name from before we met. "The house," he said quietly. "Mine," I said. "Before you. The mortgage you thought was joint was paid off 2 years ago." He closed his eyes for a moment. "I want to be clear," I said, "that I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because 2 months ago you stood in our kitchen and told me your friends thought I wasn't driven enough." I looked at Zach, then back at Brett. "I wanted you to know what you'd been standing next to." He called me 6 times on the drive home. I didn't answer. Lee had texted press releases getting traction. Business Journal picked it up. "You okay?" "I'm okay," I wrote back. "Talk tomorrow." Adi was waiting at my house. Our house, technically, though I'd already spoken with Constance about next steps. She'd made tea. We sat in the kitchen and I told her everything that had happened, every moment of it, and by the time I finished I was laughing a little, which surprised me. "Are you good?" she asked. "I think so," I said. I think I've been not good for a while and I got used to it. Brett came home around midnight. I was still in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and in the low light he looked very young, in a way he hadn't in years. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. His voice was quiet, not angry, just lost. "I tried," I said. "In the beginning, you changed the subject every time. After a while, I stopped trying." "That's not." He stopped himself, swallowed. "I didn't know I was doing that." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the problem." He sat down. We talked for 2 hours, the longest real conversation we'd had in years. He apologized. He said things that were genuine, and things that were defensive, and things that circled back to being genuine again. I believed most of it. I believed he was sorry in the way people are sorry when they realize they've been something they didn't intend to be. But sorry doesn't always change the shape of things. At 2 in the morning, I told him I thought we needed to separate. Not because of the dinner, not because of Zach, not even because of what he'd said in the kitchen. Because of everything under all of that. The years of a conversation we'd never managed to have, the silence I'd built my success inside of. The question neither of us had answered honestly. Who were we to each other really, when you took away the roles we'd assigned ourselves? He nodded. He didn't fight it. That was 7 months ago. The separation has been civil. Constance handled the legal side with her usual precision. The house stayed mine. Had always been mine. Brett moved into an apartment near his office. We've had a few hard phone calls and one unexpectedly okay dinner where we talked like people who genuinely known each other once, which I suppose we had. The firm is doing well. The Hargrove integration has gone better than projected. Leigh and I hired 2 new senior consultants in January, and we're expanding the Atlanta office this spring. Last month, I was invited to speak at a conference in Nashville on crisis communication for women-led businesses. Standing at the podium looking out at the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Like myself. Like the version of myself that had existed before I'd started organizing mornings around someone else's coffee temperature. I've thought a lot about what I would do differently. Not about the dinner. That I'd do again, though maybe with less choreography, maybe more plainly. But the years before, the silence I'd chosen, again and again, thinking I was protecting something, when really I was slowly making myself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of who I should be. The thing about invisibility is that it feels like safety for a long time. You don't make a target of yourself. You don't have to defend anything. You move through your life and your success and your ambitions, and no one can take aim at what they can't see. But eventually you disappear. Not to them. To yourself. A few weeks after everything, Addie sent me a screenshot. Someone had posted about the Hargrove acquisition on a local business community page, and in the comments a woman had written, "I went to school with Sloan Park. Honestly not surprised. She was always the most prepared person in any room. I just don't think she knew we could all see it." I read that 3 times. I'd spent 4 years in a marriage where the person closest to me couldn't see it. And all along, people who'd known me for 5 minutes could. I saved the screenshot. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because it's a good reminder that being seen, really seen, was never actually the problem. Choosing who gets to look. That's the part I'm still working on. If you're somewhere in the middle of what I was, in the middle of the quiet, the smallness, the sense that you've been editing yourself down to something more manageable, for so long you've forgotten what the full version looks like, I just want to say this. The full version is still there. It kept going, even when you weren't watching. Even when no one was watching. You built something. Don't let anyone tell you they just didn't notice because it wasn't worth noticing. They didn't notice because they weren't paying attention. There's a difference, and it matters. I've thought about what I'd say if someone asked me what I actually learned from all of this. Not the business lessons, not the legal stuff, but the real thing underneath all of it. I think it comes down to this. What you allow to go unnamed doesn't disappear. It just builds pressure. For 4 years, I told myself I was being patient, thoughtful, that I was protecting something fragile in Brett. by not making him feel overshadowed. And maybe in the beginning there was some truth to that. But at some point, patience stopped being a virtue and started being a habit I'd mistaken for one. I wasn't protecting him anymore. I was protecting a version of our marriage that had already quietly stopped being real. The actions I took or didn't take all those years had consequences I didn't fully see until I was standing in them. Every time I changed the subject when work came up, every time I deposited money into the joint account without explanation and let him assume what he wanted, every time I sat at a dinner and listened to Zach talk about ambition while I said nothing, those weren't neutral choices. They were choices that shaped what Brett believed about me and eventually what I believed about myself. That's the part no one tells you about invisibility. You think you're choosing it strategically. You think you're the one in control. But invisibility has a way of becoming your actual address if you live there long enough. What I respect about where I ended up, even on the hard nights, even in the months when the separation felt like grief for something I couldn't fully name, is that I finally stopped negotiating with my own reality. Lee used to say that the most important thing in a crisis isn't the facts. It's whether you're willing to see them clearly. I applied that principle to every client we ever had. It took me embarrassingly long to apply it to myself. Intelligence without honesty is just sophistication in the service of avoidance. I was smart enough to build something significant and somehow not honest enough with Brett, but mostly with myself, to insist that it be seen. That's not wisdom. That's a very elaborate way of hiding. And resilience, the real kind, not the bumper sticker version, isn't about bouncing back from hard things. It's about being willing to stay in the discomfort long enough to understand what it's actually telling you. The night of Brett's birthday dinner, when the room went quiet and I watched him read that press release, I wasn't triumphant. I was just finally present. For the first time in years, I wasn't managing the situation. I was in it. Sloan Park, co-founder. Those words in that press release were just words. But they were my words, in my name, about something I'd actually made. And no amount of oat milk coffee at exactly 140 degrees was worth trading that for. If you're somewhere I was, building quietly, shrinking carefully, telling yourself it's temporary, I just want you to know that the cost of invisibility compounds. The longer you let it run, the more it costs to reclaim yourself. Not because the world punishes you for it, but because you do.